Good afternoon and greetings. Welcome to this update on the YEF Toolkit. My name's John Yates. I'm the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, and thank you for making the time to join us on this, at least where I am, pretty wintry, snowy day. The Youth Endowment Fund, for those who don't know us, is a charity with a £200 million endowment to spend over a decade. For what purpose? To do all we can to work with others to reduce the amount of violence committed in this country by young people, and to do all we can to intervene early to keep young people safe from getting involved in violence. I'm going to say a little bit about how we actually do that work, and then I'm going to keep that very brief, and then hand over to my colleague Pete, who's going to talk through the latest update to the toolkit, and then leave time for some questions and answers. Now, there is, for those of you who are not aficionados of Teams, there is in the very top bar a little button which is perfect for posting questions. You'll see it there it's got two speech bubbles with a little question mark in the middle of it, and so probably the eagle-eyed of us has spotted it already. That button there, if you've got any questions that you would like to ask, do just press that button and just add your question about whatever it may be, the method we're using, the approach, what we're doing with off the back of the toolkit, whatever it may be, and we will try and cover a number of them today, and if not, come back to you offline. So if you'd like a follow-up answer, do obviously add your details to the question. I'm going to say a very little bit then about the Youth Endowment Fund and where the toolkit fits in to our work, and then hand over to my colleague Pete. So in a nutshell, I'm going to talk just to this one single picture. In a nutshell, what is the Youth Endowment Fund doing to try to reduce the number of young people who get involved in acts of violence? Very simply, what we're trying to do is find what works and then build a movement to put it into practice. Find what works and then build a movement to put it into practice. The danger, of course, is you do a great job finding what works, but it doesn't matter unless we actually change things for the better for young people in this country. So what exactly are we trying to do to achieve that? Well, this one picture hopefully lays it out, and I'll talk to this very briefly. Ultimately, we're trying to do what's over on the right-hand side there, prevent children and young people from becoming involved in violence. How are we trying to do that? Well, ultimately, we're trying to do what's in the red here. We're trying to work for change. We're trying to use our funding and change the practice of other funders to scale up what works, to spread great practice, and to improve and change the system. Sometimes we know what to do, but it's the system that prevents it. So ultimately, we're trying to do the stuff in the red, but to get there, we need to do the stuff in the yellow and the blue. So firstly, we need to do the stuff in the yellow. We need to find what works. My general experience is people tend to say to me, but I know what works. My experience is that what one person tells me is not always the same as what someone else tells me. And actually, often people disagree. And I think what we need is a consensus that includes those of us who are spending money that is really clear on what works best. So how? Well, we will spend our funding evaluating great ideas, and most of our money will go out the door funding and evaluating activity to try and keep young people safe. But actually there already has been a lot of good evaluation, and so we're determined to make existing knowledge accessible, that middle square, and define what works. And that's what we're talking about today with the toolkit, and I'll come back to that at the end of what I'm saying. But the toolkit is, I think I'm incredibly proud of what we're doing with the toolkit. I think the toolkit is the best synthesis of what is really rigorously known about what works, but it can't tell us everything. And it, for example, can't tell us what the lived experience of young people's lives are like and what they feel and what they experience. And it's important we understand that, not least to inform what we should be evaluating. And so we will always spend our time and money also understanding the lives of young people. So that's the yellow. But then in order to do that, in order to find what works, we're going to use our money to fund great work so we can evaluate it. And we spend most of our money on a series of priority themes, from a support round focused on how we build a supportive home for young people, which just closed yesterday. Our next round is focused on education, absence and exclusion. So do look at our website if you're interested in what we're funding. We also do place-based funding, and we also do a series of one-off targeted projects outside of our themes. If you'd like to know more about how we use our funding, please do look at our website, and if you have any questions from that, please do drop us an email and get in touch. So that's the core of our strategy. We fund good work in the blue, to find what works in the yellow, to work for change in the red. But none of that, we could do none of that alone. And the partnerships and coalitions that we need to build with you who are watching today are absolutely pivotal there in the purple. But enough of me. What we're doing today is we're focusing on that middle square there, making existing knowledge accessible. People sometimes say, what exactly is this toolkit that you're building? I sometimes summarize it by saying, which magazine don't do a publication on reducing violence? But if they did, it would be the YEF Toolkit. That's a slightly flippant summary, but I think it's the best summary of what we're trying to do. We're trying to do highly rigorous research, but make it incredibly accessible. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Pete, who's going to talk through the toolkit and the new update to it. Pete, over to you.
Thank you, John. It's great to see you all today. Thank you very much for coming along to listen to our update on the toolkit. My name's Pete Henderson. I'm head of toolkit and synthesis at the YEF, and it's my job to work with many others, academics, practitioners, policymakers, to review the best available evidence on preventing serious youth violence and try to make that as accessible as possible to the lay reader. So I'm going to start off by, before we get into the updates, I'm going to do a quick recap on what the toolkit is, what it aims to do, and how it works. So what does the YEF Toolkit aim to do? Well, the first thing is that it aims to provide an online and completely free to access overview of existing research on approaches to preventing serious youth violence. The focus is on approaches, interventions, programs, so tangible things that we could put in place to hopefully prevent children getting caught up in crime and violence. So it doesn't quite summarise the research on what causes violence or people's views on violence. It focuses on interventions and programs. And the aim is really to produce something for a non-academic audience. We've tried to make it as accessible as possible. To do this, we've involved practitioners in reviewing content and user testing the website. We've also worked with a group of young people who advised us throughout the process on the language that we use and how we refer to young people in the programmes which we're examining. The second aim is to provide a tool which supports professional decision making. So that we think the research is extremely useful, but doesn't hold all the answers and can never precisely determine what we do. We think the research in the toolkit gives a sense of the best bets, things which have worked well in the past in other contexts. And this is a good starting point for thinking about what to do in a local context. But of course, applying the toolkit to a real world problem will require careful professional judgment, consideration of your local context, and a further evaluation of the impact of any action. Our third aim with the toolkit is to create a foundation for activities that will drive change. I'm very much aware that I can publish hopefully a nice accessible toolkit online, but just publishing things online doesn't by itself bring about the change that we need to see. To bring about the change we need to see, we need to be working with others across the sector to bring this evidence to life and think about what it really means for the changes that we want to make to systems and practices. When we spoke to our audience about what they would find useful in the toolkit, they said they wanted both a simple overview of the headline findings, but they also wanted to be able to take a deep dive into the evidence on any particular approach. So we designed the toolkit to do both. It has a front page which provides an overview of the research. This gives you an initial snapshot of the impact of different approaches, the quality of related research, and the likely cost. We think this front page can be used to start a conversation about the best bets, allows you to make comparisons at a top level between approaches. But if you want to get, and we do strongly recommend you do this, if you want to get a more detailed summary of the research, you can dig deeper into the toolkit, and we have more detailed summaries for each of the topics that we cover. So this is what the front page looks like. So for each topic in the toolkit, we include 3 pieces of information at this top level. We give an estimate of the average impact on protecting children against involvement in crime involvement in violence. And it's important to note that this is an average, and in some of these topics there's more or less variation beneath this average, and it's important to dig down into that second layer to explore some of that variation. In the middle of our 3 ratings, we also provide a rating of the quality of the evidence. This communicates the security of the evidence we've used to calculate the impact rating. It reflects our confidence in the impact rating. On the left-hand side, we provide a cost rating of £1 to £3 signs, and this gives a simple initial sense of the likely costs of an approach relative to other things that we cover in the toolkit. So if you click on any of these summary cards, it takes you through to a second layer where there's a much more detailed summary of the research on that topic. So we repeat again the sort of headlines that you've already seen on the front page. We also tag topics according to the type of prevention program that they represent, so whether they're primary, secondary or tertiary prevention, the setting in which they take place. And we also tag them with the themes that the YEF uses to organise its work. So we have a number of different themes which we use to collect different bits of our work together under one concept. And this means you can link the toolkit strands to, for example, some of the grant making work that we do. And these summaries have a much more detailed narrative on what the topic is, what the evidence says about its impact, the security of that evidence, what the evidence might say about barriers and facilitators to implementation. And that's where we cover the sort of more qualitative research that might give an indication of what people found difficult to implement, what helped them to implement a particular approach. So that's where we encourage you to really dig down and get a sense of that more detailed nuance on each particular topic. So we launched the first version of the toolkit in June this year, and we launched with an initial 13 approach topics. And this gives you a summary of the headlines for each of these 13 topics. So we allocate an impact rating to each topic. This could be a high, moderate or low impact on reducing crime or violence, a question mark, which basically communicates that we didn't have enough research. We didn't find enough research evidence to give you a confident impact rating. And there are also some topics where we found evidence that they can actually cause harm. They can put children at greater risk of involvement in violence. Hopefully you're all relatively familiar with this. This is we've published this since June. There's one thing I'll just draw your attention to here, which is that sport and physical activity, when we published in June, we initially published it with a question mark. We didn't find any rigorous systematic reviews which gave us enough research evidence in order to give you an impact rating when we looked at this in June. We thought that we'd take a closer look at this, and we funded the Campbell collaboration to do a new systematic review here and generate some new knowledge. And the evidence base is much improved in this area, and I'm really excited that we're going to update this topic in the update that we've launched today. So that gives you an overview of the toolkit's aims, how it works, and the state of the toolkit when we launched in June. But today we have launched 4 new topics. The toolkit is a live resource that will continue to update through the lifetime of the YEF. And so today is our first update of many. We're adding 4 completely new topics, but we're also adding an update to an existing topic. So I'm going to run through the new topics now. So the first topic that we're going to cover is prison awareness programs. So prison awareness programs aim to deter children and young people from crime by demonstrating the reality and difficulties of life in prison. They typically involve current or former prisoners meeting children and showing them what prison is like. And some of these programs can take a very confrontational approach to deterrence. They can treat participating children really quite harshly and focus on intimidation and fear The infamous Scared Straight is an example of a program that does this. There are some other programs which do take a softer, more educational approach, and they intend to inform children about the realities of prison without necessarily treating them harshly or scaring them. On average, we found that this approach did not seem to have a desirable impact on children's involvement in crime and violence. In fact, the research suggests it could increase the likelihood that children become involved in crime. So it's one of those topics where we've actually awarded a harmful impact rating. On average, these programs have seemed to cause harm. The next topic I'm going to talk about is restorative justice. So this is a process which supports someone who's committed a crime to communicate with the victim, understand the impact of their actions, and find a positive way forward. And the strongest evidence here relates to an approach to restorative justice called restorative conferences. And this involves a face-to-face meeting between the individual who committed the crime and the victim, led by a trained facilitator. And on average, we found research that suggests that this can have a moderate impact on preventing reoffending. So the third new topic we've looked at is A&E navigators. This was a topic where we had a huge amount of interest. Since we launched in June, we've done a lot of work to survey our audience and speak to people and try and understand what they wanted us to cover. And this frequently came out on the top of those surveys. And these are programs which place a caseworker in hospital, accident and emergency departments to support children and young people with a violence-related injury. Some of these programs have involved quite short interventions and take place solely in the emergency department, whereas other programs involve a longer and more intensive phase of case management after the child has been discharged. We were really excited that a new review was published on this year, so we were able to include this in the toolkit. We do have very low confidence in our estimate as the research is still in its infancy. The research is at an early stage on this topic, but the evidence suggests that these programs could be capable of producing large impacts. We've also found some evidence to suggest that these programs could be more effective when they combine the kind of short intervention in A&E with a longer follow-up phase after the child has been discharged. The fourth and final new topic that we're introducing is trauma-informed training and service redesign. Again, there's a huge amount of interest in this area, but unfortunately on this topic we found very little research. So this summary focuses on training and other workforce changes which have a primary and explicit aim of improving staff understanding and response to trauma. It makes a lot of sense that these types of interventions could support more understanding and kinder practice, but the aim of the toolkit is to try and understand where there is really rigorous evidence to show links between interventions and activities and reductions in crime and violence. We're really focused on that specific outcome. Unfortunately, we found very little research which rigorously investigated this link. It's important to emphasise here that we're not saying that this activity doesn't work, just that we haven't found any research. We're currently speaking to other What Works centres about how we can improve the evidence base in this area. This is a topic I hope to come back to in the future and update. We also updated one existing topic. So we looked at sports in the first version of the toolkit, sports physical activity programs, but unfortunately we didn't find any existing reviews of the research. So we decided to commission our own review of the literature. Our review found a small but promising evidence base. It suggested that these programs can have large positive effects. Although this evidence base has improved, we still have relatively low confidence in our headline impact rating. The evidence quality is 2 out of 5. So there's some new evidence here, but it's still there's still relatively low confidence. So that hopefully gives you a taste of the update which we've launched today. All of those topics are available in the toolkit. They're all currently live, so please do go away, have a dig through them, look through them, and do let us know if you have any further questions. hopefully the update demonstrates that the toolkit is a live resource, and we'll be looking to, over the next few years, both adding new topics, but also updating the evidence within existing topics as new evidence emerges. So I just wanted to talk to you about some of the next steps we're taking to keep the toolkit up to date and make sure it reflects the latest research and latest thinking. So here are the next steps. So one of the things we're going to be doing, and will be a big focus for us over the next few years, is we're going to be funding a series of new literature reviews, new systematic reviews. We're focused on making these reviews as comprehensive and systematic as possible. And that's because in order to create new toolkit strands, we have to have reviews of the literature. And there are many areas which we're really interested in where no one's done a really rigorous review yet. So we're going to have to go out and fund some of those ourselves. We're currently thinking about which topics we're going to focus on, and we really appreciate your help with this. We're going to come on to how you can help with this in a moment. We hope to keep the toolkit updated around twice a year. That update might mean a number of things. It could be new evidence, new topics. We're thinking also about new functionality, and we'll be working towards the next update in June 2022. That update is likely to focus on adding some new topics and hopefully also updating some of the existing topics that we launched in June. Finally, when we've spoken to people about the toolkit, one of the bits of feedback we've had is, well, great, the toolkit gives us an overview of the evidence base, but what kind of guidance can you give on the how to get this working? What's the evidence on implementation? And how do we combine the evidence base in the toolkit with, for example, some of the insights that are coming out of the work the YEF's doing on capturing youth voice? And so we're thinking about how we can develop some more detailed implementation guidance, which brings together insights from across our work, focuses on a particular slice of the toolkit, and does a real deep dive on the evidence there to give some sort of really detailed recommendations. I mentioned that we're thinking about topics in the future. We're about to commission a series of new systematic reviews. This is a list of the topics that we're considering. One of the things that comes out often when we speak to people about their interests is this idea of contextual safeguarding. Awareness raising campaigns. By that we mean sort of information campaigns which try and raise awareness of the problem of violence, provide information to young people, the kind of sort of public health communications campaigns that are quite common in this area. We think it'd be interesting to have a toolkit strand on those. We're also looking at things like outreach youth work is something that comes out as very popular. Specialist trauma-focused interventions. By that we mean interventions which seek to help individual children who have had a traumatic experience and experiencing trauma, and give those kinds of interventions give them a very sort of specialist targeted response to help them recover. This is things like trauma-focused CBT is what we're referring to here. What we'd love to do is a colleague of mine is now going to share a survey with you through the announcement system in Teams. It would be fantastic if you could fill that survey out and give us a sense of which of these topics is a priority to you. I think it's really important that the toolkit is both responding to where there's the strongest evidence, but also responds to where there's the greatest demand from our audience. So we're really keen to hear from you if you fill that survey out and let us know what topics you're interested in. Fantastic. Well, we've got some time now for a bit of discussion, and questions have been coming in. So John will tee up some questions for us to discuss and respond to. We're particularly keen to hear from you with any suggestions about what you'd like to see next in the toolkit. Please do complete our survey or let us know through the question function if you think that anything's missing from that survey. Fantastic. Thank you very much for listening to that and coming to see us. Let's get stuck into some questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pete. Let me kick us off with a couple of questions we've got here. I want to tee us in to talk about trauma, which is an important area that we're wrestling with here. But before we do, just a couple of methodological questions that people have asked. The first is, what kinds of evidence meets the criteria to inform the toolkit? And if I can give you a second one, could you go into more detail about how you assess the quality of the evidence and how effective the impact is? For example, is it based on just the number of evaluations, or is there more to it than that? And Pete, we'll just come over to you now. You're on mute at the moment, but
apologies, I'm with you now. Great questions. So we consider a range of research when we write the toolkit. So something that sits behind the toolkit is the YEF evidence and gap map, and that's essentially a database of 2,000 studies looking at interventions, programs, approaches that could help us prevent serious youth violence. And we've made that database freely available on our website, so anyone can access that and have a look through those 2,000 studies. And the toolkit draws on the studies that are available in that map. And we look at studies which are both about the impact of particular interventions. So that might be things like randomized controlled trials, which try and rigorously estimate the impact. And what we particularly focus on are systematic reviews of those studies. So we look for reviews which for work that people have done to systematically and comprehensively summarize the entirety of an evidence base on a particular topic, and do that in a particularly unbiased and systematic way. So that kind of systematic review process is really important. Unbiased. An unbiased impression of the impact and the quality of that evidence. We also look at another form of evidence, which is often of a more kind of qualitative nature. It might be based on interviews and focus groups and surveys with the people involved in interventions. And that's the kind of research which informs the content of the toolkit, which focuses on implementation. So that might often speak to people about what seemed to facilitate, what seemed to make it easier for them to implement the intervention, but also what might be the barriers, what do they find really difficult. That kind of research gives us a really kind of rich contextual detail about the implementation factors in an intervention. The second question was about how we arrive at the updates. So the evidence rating, the evidence quality rating, is based on a few things. It's based on, yes, the number of studies available. It's based on the quality of the systematic review, which has summarized those studies. It's based on also the heterogeneity or the variation in those studies. So if those studies seem to cluster on the same conclusion, they seem to say the same things, then we give a higher evidence rating. But if they seem to say quite different things, then we tend to give a lower evidence rating. And we also look at the sort of the directness of the information available. So in some approaches, there aren't direct estimates on the impact on crime, but there's an estimate of the impact on something which is related to crime. So that might be externalizing behaviour or bullying perpetration. And we've used that information to try and give our best estimate of the likely impact on keeping children safe from crime and violence. The impact estimate, well, that's based on what's called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a technique that people use in systematic reviews to rigorously synthesize and bring together the estimates from many studies. So it gives you a sense of the average effect of that approach. And that's what we base the impact rating on. But then we then explore how that effect varies within the approach on that second layer. So yeah, great questions. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pete. I want to just go to the question of trauma-informed training and process design. So we've said that specific area of training on trauma-informed and work on process redesign, the evidence is not yet strong enough for us to have a view. So a question that people are asking, one is, where can we look at the evidence? Where can we look at what you did find? How can we almost check you're working, if you like? A second question here is just what the distinction we're making. We said we're going to do another piece of work on specialist trauma-informed practice. Can we just make really clear the distinction of what we're talking about in the toolkit update today and what we're not talking about when we say the evidence isn't yet clear?
Yeah, of course. So if you want to look at any of the research which informs the toolkit summary, you can scroll down to the bottom of that summary, and in the downloads section there's a link to a technical report. And that technical report was prepared for us by the Campbell collaboration, and that summarises the research which we've used to write the summary, and also gives you some more information about how we've arrived at the ratings. And on the question about distinguishing between the two concepts, the approach in the toolkit that we've launched today focuses on training and redesigning services which have the aim of supporting organisations and staff to think about trauma, recognise its signs and symptoms, and avoid re-traumatising the young people they work with. It's a more of a sort of universal intervention designed to try and bring about a better improvement to practice. It might be something that's delivered in schools, for example. The trauma-focused, the specialist interventions to support children who've experienced trauma are a much more targeted intervention for individual children who have had a traumatic experience, and the intervention might be to give them some trauma-focused CBT, for example, or other kinds of sort of specialist psychological therapy, often delivered by a trained psychologist, to help them deal with the trauma, overcome the problems they're having with their symptoms, and move forward. So there's a difference between a very sort of a universal intervention, trying to bring about general improvements to practice in schools and in social care, for example, and a very specialist intervention usually delivered by a trained psychologist for individual recoveries from trauma.
Thanks, Pete. I was keen that we just clarified that. There is obviously a huge amount of practice that we've looked at in the toolkit, which is informed by trauma, and obviously trauma is central to so much of young people's experience of violence. And what we wanted to look at today was specific programs of training that come in that are often quite short term, or come in quite short term and look at process redesign with a focus on trauma, and the evidence there is not yet strong enough to make a conclusion. We will, as Pete says, be looking much more specifically at very specialist programs designed to meet young people's needs, particularly with regard to trauma. So a complicated area, and we just want to be clear what we're saying and what we're not saying. Coming back to other questions. So a good question here. A couple of questions that go together, actually. Don't we need multi-level work to address these complex needs? One programme on its own will never be enough. Does the YEF have plans to evaluate combinations of approaches, for example, restorative justice and mentoring, and trauma-informed sports and social training, for example? So that's one. Do we have plans to try and pull together evidence where things are being combined? The other one is slightly different question. I'm interested in some of the challenges of funding quality research. I have programs that I believe have impact but have not been able to afford an RCT. Is this something that could help, that YEF could help with, in order to get robust evaluation of programs? Obviously, feel free to throw one of those back to me if that's helpful, Pete, but I'll let you lead off.
Thanks, John. Great questions. The sort of multi-component nature of this work is a really interesting one. I think what we're trying to do in the toolkit is try and understand the impact of individual components, so that when we combine them together, we can focus on things which are the best bets, and together they hopefully make for the biggest impact. There are bits of the toolkit where we do explore the sort of links between different strands. So, for example, the sports strand is one where often mentoring interventions are kind of embedded within the context of the sports program, and that's something we look at in the sports program and think about how that might affect the implementation and impact. So we try and explore these links where we have research available to. But it's also an area where the research isn't as strong as we would like, and it's an area where we're trying to improve the research through the work we're doing to fund new research. So a lot of the new projects that the YEF is funding do explore some of these links. They'll often look at various different things within a sort of the context of a sports program, so that we can generate some of that evidence about how the sum of these things might be more beneficial than the parts. I'm sorry, John, in answering that first question, I forgot the second one, but I think also it might be a better one for you to tackle.
Thanks, Pete. So the question was, I have work that would benefit from accessing funding for an RCT. Can the YEF play a role there? There's a slightly similar question, which is, how does the work that YEF funds and their evaluations relate back to the toolkit? What's the link between these two? So perhaps I'll take this briefly. If I come back to the mission, the mission of this charity, it's to find what works and then build a movement to put it into practice. To find what works and then build a movement to put it into practice. And so what's key for us is we want to use, in our first few years of life, we want to use our funding to fund the evaluation, high quality, as much as we can, RCTs of activity that many of you are delivering. And so we are always interested in things that we could potentially fund high quality impact evaluation of. But the challenge is that £200 million over 10 years sounds like much more money than it actually is in practice. There is a limit to how many RCTs we can fund. We can probably do about 10 to 15 a year. And so that means we have to be quite choosy. And this is where the toolkit plays back into where we spend our money and where we evaluate. Because what we're trying to do is firstly work out, where are the gaps? Where actually would it be really beneficial for more research to take place? So police and schools, for example, is on the toolkit as an area with a question mark. I think that creates a challenge for us about, should we be funding or at least supporting the evaluation of work in that space? Mentoring is an area that actually is quite promising on the toolkit, but it'd be wonderful to know a bit more about how well that works and how well different types of practice work. Focused deterrence is something we highlight on the toolkit. Nearly all of the high quality evaluation has been outside of England and Wales, and so there'll be a real value in trying to do more work here. So we use the toolkit to try and help us identify where we've got gaps, where we would like to then target our funding and therefore our evaluation. The way that works in practice is the launch of these different rounds, and so we try to launch a round at a time, which allows us to then really bring the best of the toolkit to bear to inform the decisions that we make. You can read more about this on our website looking at our strategy, but we're also very happy to receive emails with questions. We're keen to be as transparent as we can about this process. But as I say, in the first few years, it's about building the evidence base, but then ultimately it's got to be about change. If this is just a wonky academic exercise, it serves no purpose. It has to be such that we change practice to change things for young people. So a couple more questions here, Pete, coming in. One of the questions is, to what extent, I'll read it as it is, something for the future, maybe with links to development of trauma-informed, what are the key approaches within the evidence that work in common across the evidence base? For example, safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment, peer support. In other words, to what extent are we able to pull out some themes that might be good practice across activity?
That's a great question, and something we're interested in the sort of next phase of the toolkit work. So the ability, the sort of challenge of the toolkit is that we're relying on the existing reviews, the ways in which people have reviewed the research. We're relying on the way that academics have cut up the research evidence. With the new reviews that we're funding, we have the opportunity to ask the questions which really interest us, and examine whether some of these themes, which are of particular interest to our audience, come out in the evidence time and again across different approaches. So yeah, that's certainly something we're thinking about as we sort of scope these new literature reviews, and think about the questions which we ask of the research using that new work. The other thing that's relevant here is this sort of implementation guidance, and that allows us to take a much more detailed look at some of this material, and combine it with some of the evidence that we're gathering around sort of young people's voice and secondary data analysis, and that's another area where we could potentially explore some of those themes.
Fantastic, thank you, Pete. That's excellent. And so I think we've gone through the core questions. Many of the questions people have asked. There's a couple we haven't fully got to that I hope we might come back to personally. So if you've asked a question, you haven't got a response today, and you haven't told us who you are, do let us know, and we'll make sure we reply personally. I hope this has been helpful and informative and interesting and thought-provoking. The toolkit is right at the centre of our commitment to find what works, and then we must build on it in all that we do by listening to the voices of young people. You can see more on our website about the largest peer-led research project that the country's ever seen that we've launched this year, as well as the way that the Youth Advisory Board influences what we do here at the YEF. But it also must be combined with practitioner experience. And so we will be building on the toolkit to launch a series of more detailed guidance reports that bring together, OK, sport is a good place to focus, but what do we know from practitioner experience, from young people's voices, and the best research we can get as to how we implement this and how it works. So the toolkit is very much a key element of making change happen, but it's important that we build on it and bring more into it as well. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time today. Do please get in touch. You've got Pete's email address there. I'm exactly the same email function to find, john.yates@youthendowmentfund.org.uk, and we're always keen to be accessible and transparent. And please do, if you haven't already, you can just Google YEF Toolkit and you'll find it. Someone asked if we were going to do a demo today. I think it is really incredibly easy to find and use, and so please do type that into Google, click, and you'll find all the information exactly as we've laid it out. And if you find it at all complicated to navigate, don't hesitate to let us know. We're always keen to try and improve as we go. Thank you very much, everyone. I look forward to seeing you all outside of this digital box we find ourselves in. All the best, and have a great rest of the afternoon.